What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. And in this week's video, I'm going to show you how I built these super simple, extremely cheap DIY acoustic panels. These have tremendously reduced the echo in this space, and they were extremely quick and easy to build. So let's go ahead and get started with the project.
Before we get started with the project, I want to give a quick shout out to LastPass, who is the sponsor of this week's video, and we'll talk more about LastPass a little later in the video. So these acoustic panels can be built from multiple different types of wood, but we used 2x4s since we had a bunch left over from framing out this shop space. That said, 1x4s would make for a lighter weight panel, or you could even use plywood ripped into 3.5-inch wide strips if you had some scraps lying around. So since the insulation we used is designed to work with a 16-inch on center stud spacing and comes in 4-foot lengths, we decided to make these panels match those dimensions just to avoid having to cut the insulation. The long sides of the panels were cut to 96 inches and the center pieces were cut to 14.5 inches. And if you buy your lumber in 8-foot lengths, you can get one panel out of 2.5 pieces or 2 panels out of 5 pieces, and for each panel you'll only have to make about 3 cuts. Also, as you can see, we're using a miter saw here, but a circular saw or even a handsaw would have no trouble cutting the pieces for this project. And since we were building 9 of these frames, we needed to be as efficient as possible, but don't let the fact that you don't own a miter saw stop you from trying this project. Before assembling the frame, we marked the center of the long sides and transferred a line across the inside face of these pieces, which just made lining up the center pieces during assembly later a little bit easier. And since we were building so many of these, my buddy Justin was able to mark the centers out while I cut the 2x4s to size at the miter saw. Alright, on to assembly. So we used 3-inch deck screws to assemble the frame, adding 2 screws at each connection point, and these screws don't require any pre-drilling, which really sped up the assembly process. We made sure to keep the pieces as flush as we could during assembly, but you can see that some of these 2x4s were pretty dang twisted. And one tip to help with that is to drive the screws in partially before assembling your frames, as it leaves you with one free hand to hold the boards in place while driving in the screws. Also, if you're using 1x4s rather than 2x4s here, you should use 1.25-inch screws instead of 3-inch screws. I'd also recommend pre-drilling the holes to prevent splitting in that case, since the holes will be much closer to the ends of the boards. Once we built the frames, we could get the fabric attached, and we used this white landscape fabric that Justin had left over from a previous project, but pretty much any fabric that allows sound to pass through would work. I know a lot of people use burlap when building these panels as it's inexpensive, readily available, and looks pretty nice. We cut the fabric to width, which worked out almost perfectly to cutting this fabric in half lengthwise, and we made sure to leave at least about 6 inches of overhanging fabric wrapped around the back of the frame. So to attach the fabric, we used a pneumatic Nero Crown stapler since we were building 9 of these panels, but pretty much any staple gun would work here. And since we were using the pneumatic stapler, we made sure to do some tests and lowered the air pressure so that the staples didn't fire right through the fabric. So when attaching the fabric to a frame like this, there's a pattern to follow that ends up significantly reducing the number of wrinkles you end up with. First, we added a few staples at the center of each end, making sure to stretch the fabric around the frame, keeping it taut when adding the staples. Next, we repeated the same step on the long sides of the frame, adding staples at the center. And with the fabric tacked into place, we just slowly worked our way outwards from the center of each side, adding a few staples while keeping the fabric taut. And as you can see, as we worked our way towards the corners, the wrinkles were pulled out and we were left with a nice clean edge. When we got to the corners, we would gather the excess fabric, tucking one face flat against the frame, and then we could just fold over the excess at a 45-degree angle. Again, while holding the fabric taut, we would add some more staples to hold the corners in place. Finally, we flipped over the panel and added a few staples in the center divider, which will help to keep the fabric from sagging under the weight of the insulation since we hung these panels horizontally. If you're planning to hang your panels on the wall vertically, this step isn't necessary. While we're attaching the rest of the fabric, let's talk about the sponsor of this week's video, LastPass. So if you're anything like me, you have a ton of passwords to remember, everything from social media accounts to emails to banking. It can be a lot to keep up with. And we all know that using the same password for multiple logins is incredibly unsafe, and that's where LastPass comes in. So with LastPass, you don't have to remember your passwords or write them down, you won't have to reset your passwords because you forgot which one you used, and you won't even have to type in your usernames and passwords since LastPass fills them in for you. And LastPass will even autofill your credentials in apps on your iOS or Android devices, keeping you secure on the go. Best of all, LastPass has unlimited password storage, so you'll never run out of space for passwords, and their free cross-device sync means you'll have your passwords handy whether you're on your phone, tablet, desktop, or laptop. So click the link below to find out more about LastPass, and thanks again to LastPass for sponsoring this week's video. Alright, on to the insulation. So we use this Rockwool Safe and Sound soundproof insulation, which is the same insulation we used in the walls of this shop space. Each bag of insulation is about $50, and a bag contains 12 bats, which is enough for 6 of these acoustic panels. And this insulation is also readily available at most home centers. Adding the insulation was super simple since we sized the frames to fit the bats without cutting them. All we needed to do was stuff the insulation in place, making sure not to compact it too much, which would reduce the soundproofing qualities. And after adding the insulation, we would add a few more staples just to hold the excess fabric in place. Also, this insulation is extremely itchy, so we wore gloves during this process and made sure to avoid touching it with our exposed skin, and I actually put on a long sleeve shirt and respirator when we were adding the insulation to the rest of the 9 frames. After adding the insulation, we added these little angle brackets called joist angles, which are only about 50 cents each and were pretty much perfect for this. And I'll have a link to these brackets along with all of the other tools and materials I used in this project in the video description below. I used 1 1/4" screws to attach the brackets to the frame, but you'll want to use shorter screws, something maybe in the neighborhood of 3/4 of an inch long if you were using 1x4s for your frames. As I mentioned earlier, we mounted the panels horizontally on the ceiling in my shop, and before mounting, we marked out the location of the panel so that the panels would be centered between the lights, and then we could get them mounted. So since my ceiling is concrete, we had to use a hammer drill to drill the holes, and then we used 1 1/4" concrete anchors to attach the panels to the ceiling. If you're mounting these panels to a more standard ceiling with wood joists above it, you would first need to use a stud finder to find your joist locations, and then make sure to drive your screws into those joists. And I would recommend something like 2-inch lag screws for fastening these panels to wooden joists. That should provide plenty of holding power. And we just continued mounting the panels until we had them all in place, and then I could record an audio test to see how much the panels impacted the echo in the space, and here's that before and after footage. This is the sound in the room before adding any of the soundproofing insulation or any of these kind of acoustic panels that we're going to be building. So I'm right at 8 feet from the camera. I've got a shotgun mic on the camera, so we'll fast forward to when everything's installed and we can see how much of a difference it made. All right, I want to do one more sound test in this space. I have added back the plywood and fiber cement wall coverings, so obviously it's added back a little bit of echo, but I still think these acoustic panels have helped tremendously. All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. Again, this was a super simple project that has made a huge difference in this space. I'm actually planning on building a few more of these acoustic panels for my office where I record my voiceover. So I will have a detailed article on my website with all of the dimensions and that kind of thing. So in case you're wanting to build these for yourself, you can go check that out. And I'll also have links to all of the tools and materials I use down in the video description below. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and until next time, happy building.